Okay, as you recall in the last video, what we did was we grabbed a list of countries. We looped through all of these items in this table here and pulled out the proper link in order for us to pull out the 2-character code for each country in order for us to link to the actual country. And so in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to grab the economic data. So we're going to come down here in this accordion, and then we're going to pull out all the specific economic numbers. Okay, returning to our editor here. The first thing we need to do is we need to pull in our dependencies. The first one is going to be requests. And the second one obviously is Beautifulsoup. And once we do that, what we're going to do here is we're going to set up a function to get the HTML from, that way every time we run this, it can just use the same function. And we'll call this get HTML from page. Okay, so what we need to do at this point, we're going to be passing in a country code. And we'll pass in GM for Germany just as the default. That way, while we're debugging this, it'll just make things easier. I'll switch back over to the browser, and then we have Germany loaded here. So what we need to do is we need to copy the URL. And so our country code is going to go in here. So what I'm going to do is just break this out, and then our country code, we're going to be able to dynamically change this each time. I'll set up a new variable called response. And so the HTML, we're going to return that as a string, so we need to get the response text. And we'll just go ahead and return our HTML. Okay, once we have our HTML, we can just set up a new variable called soup. And the first argument that we need to pass in is the HTML, followed by the parser. And we'll just be using the Python built-in HTML parser. Okay, so now we need to return to the page to look at what we're actually going to parse and how we're going to get to the content that we need. So if we come down here, we can click to expand economy, and let's just do an inspect element on that. And you can see like all these things are within these. So we have an unordered list for the entire accordion, and each one is a separate li list item. And you notice that we got these classes, so expand and collapse. So that's really not something that we can rely on. What I think is happening is when you load the page and then the class is being added by JavaScript. So when we download the page, we're not executing all that JavaScript, so we can't rely on this, that this class is going to be here when we need to parse it. So we need to find an alternative for doing that. So let's just keep scrolling down. Let's look at the very first item, this purchasing power parity. And let's do an inspect on that. So what we have is an ID, a field for this div. And then right after the field, so we got these category datas which hold the actual data. And so this is not very good HTML markup because an ID should only be used once, and they're basically using it for every single header for each category that they have. But before we even get to this, what we need to do is we need to make sure we get inside the correct list item. And to get inside the correct list item, we have to get inside the correct unordered list also. So let's start off by setting up a new function to get the correct list item to get into this whole section right here. And for that, let's go ahead and just define a new function. That way we can separate this whole thing out. And we'll call this get economic list item. And we'll pass our soup into this function. I'm going to set up a new variable, call it parent li for list item, and set that to none. One thing that we notice from this is that we have a div ID here of field. And then, so purchasing power parity, that's going to be unique in here because it's not, purchasing power parity is only going to be in the economic section. We're not going to find it in any of these other sections. So that is one difference that this whole list item is going to have that's going to be different from the others. So we can use that. First thing, let's grab all these div tags with the ID of field. And we're going to call the Beautifulsoup Find All method. And we're going to use the name parameter with the ID of field. Normally, the normal way that we would find by the ID is that we would not use the find all, we would just use the find method, because in proper HTML markup, an ID is only used once, but it's used multiple times on the page that we're parsing. And we can go ahead and loop through these. And let's go ahead and pull the text out of this. And when we use the Beautifulsoup Find All method, we're going to get a list of elements of Beautifulsoup elements, so we can continue using the Beautifulsoup methods. So we're going to use the getText method here. Now we're going to search for purchasing power parity. So if the purchasing power parity is in the text, in that case, so if purchasing power parity is in the text, we know we're in the correct list item. So using our variable, we can go ahead and populate this. We can use the find method, the find parent method, which is another Beautifulsoup method. And then we don't want the immediate parent, we want the first parent list item. So we need to pass in our li element. And once we have that, we can just go ahead and return it. And I'm going to set up the same variable down here. So we're going to get our economic list item. And we're going to pass in soup. And I'm going to go ahead and print this. And let's go ahead and run it and make sure that we are actually getting the correct list item. Okay, it looks like we did do that. Let's click to expand here, and then yeah, so this has to be, because this is all the economic data, so we have amounts for all of these. If we go to the very top, so here's where it starts off, and we have that long description, and we can see that our description is right here, so we are grabbing, starting with that, and then all of our GDP data, and so on. Another thing I like to do is, so once we're able to download the page, is I save a copy of the page locally. That way we're not waiting each time we download while we're trying to set this up for debugging and such. So I'm going to set up a new function. Let's call this save file. Another thing I like to do is store the file locally. Is if I'm going to have something where I'm going to be setting up unit tests, I'd rather have that file locally than each time I run my unit test, then it re-downloads all the files. We don't want to wait for that. So we're going to save a file offline. Let's pass in a variable called contents. And setting up our context manager. So we're going to open, and we'll call this testing.html. So we need to call f.write. And once we save it, we obviously have to be able to get it from an actual file. And we'll call save file. And then the next time we run this, we can just get the HTML from the file. I'm going to comment that out for now and run this. So if we come to our files, so our full HTML is in here. So this makes it very easy to actually put a split view here. So this makes it very easy to, when you have it locally, it's much easier. We can, use Control F to find stuff a lot easier than just having it inside the browser. Okay, so I'm going to X out of this for now. And now that we have our file locally, every time we try to debug something, we don't have to re-download it. So I'm going to uncomment this and then comment this out. And then if we rerun this, it should be pulling from our local file, and we should be able to still get the parent list item, the same way as if we were downloading the regular web page. Okay, so in order to get the economic data, let's set up a new function for that. And so what we're going to have is our parent list item. I'm just going to pass in a variable called parent. And I'm going to set up an empty dictionary for the economic data. Now, if we go back to the web page, let's take a look at this real quick. What we have is actually let's come down here to our first item where we have actual economic numbers. So we have a class or an ID of field, a div tag with an ID of field, followed by 3 items of category data. So the header is set up like this, and then the supporting data is underneath. And each one is for the prior year, then the year before that. And some of them are going to have multiple years. A few of them are going to be a little bit different. Obviously, this is a little bit tricky to pull out and stuff. It's not like we have a parent div and then... so these are basically... One thing that is working for us is that these are reliably in order. Once we get the field, we know that we can get the data immediately after it because it's always seems to be in order. So if we go to gross national saving, for example, it's going to be more of the same. Let's go back to the editor, and then I'm going to set up another variable called current category. And let's set that to none. Let's go ahead and grab all of the div tags out of so we're passing into this function our parent list item. So that's the only HTML that we have. So once we know we're inside the economic data section, we can loop through the div tags. Actually, we need to grab all the div tags first. So we need to use the find all method, and we're going to be finding every single div. The first thing that we're going to encounter is one of those, when we find the data that we want to save, it's going to have that ID of field. So if div, and we're going to check the attributes. So remember, attributes, div.attributes, inside Beautifulsoup, that's going to return us a dictionary of all the attributes. So we're going to use the get method for ID. If we don't use the get method, if we just try to access the ID property, we could get an error if that ID is not set. Every time we encounter a div with the ID of field, we're going to be changing categories. Whereas this one is gross national saving. So what we want to do is get the current category and set that variable. And we're going to call the get text method. So what we have our string, and then we also have a colon at the end. So we want to just get rid of the colon. That's pretty easy to do. We're going to use the string replace method. And we'll just replace that with nothing. And then just in case, we'll call the strip method. That'll trim any white space or line breaks or anything if those happen to get inside the HTML tag. And once we have a variable called current category, we're going to set that up in our economic data dictionary. And we'll just set that to an empty list. So immediately following these div tags with the ID of field, we should encounter that first. So we should have a category set before we reach our first category data. So the next thing that we need to grab is all of these category data items. So we're going to use div.get, and then we're going to be looking for the class. So we want to make sure it has a class first so we don't get any errors. And let's go category data. Now, if we get the class, Beautifulsoup knows that each HTML element can have multiple classes. A double equals here, we have to use in because it's a list that's going to have multiple things in it. If it only has one class, it's going to be a list of one item. Okay, let's set up a variable, category data. And once again, we want to get the text of this div tag. And so we want to access the dictionary of our current category. And we want to append a new item. And once we have looped through all of these and gotten all the fields and its corresponding data, we want to return our economic data. And so obviously, from earlier, we saved the file locally. So each time we iterate through this to debug it, it's going to be much faster because we don't have to wait for the latency of downloading the page every single time. Okay, so down here, we need a new variable. And once we get the economic data, it's the easiest way to see is just to pretty print it. So let's go ahead and import that. Okay, and once we have our economic data, if everything is working properly, we should get some sort of structured data, basically a dictionary that contains, for each one of the categories, should be its own dictionary item. So let's go ahead and run that. And if we click to expand here, then yeah, we do obviously we got the text at the beginning, and then all of our metrics, so growth rates and GDP numbers, they're all separated by its own dictionary item, followed by the items in the list. The reason why we have a list is for some of them, there's multiple items because they go back, 3 years. So yeah, this is one way to get a single country into structured data. And once we have this, we have something that we can work with. So in the last video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to take our list of countries that we got from, this is what we got from the very first video, is all the country codes. And then we're going to be able to loop through those and then grab the economic data for each one and save all that data.